start with, I'm going to talk about the effects of school choice, but to sort of understand where my research fits in, it helps to understand what the issue is when you don't have choice, or what some of these issues are. So in Kansas City, Missouri, you will find a lot of empty school buildings. Back in the late 1960s, there were 77,000 children Kansas City, 77,000 children in the Kansas City school system. This year, there are a little over 17,000. What happened to the other 60,000 kids? All right? To understand the answer to that question, it helps to know that in the United States, there are about the same number of 0 to 4-year-olds as there are 5 to 9-year-olds. Right? They're both 5-year cohorts. That's not true in Kansas City. There are actually 15% fewer 5 to 9-year-olds and 0 to 4-year-olds. And only 10 miles away in Overland Park, Kansas, there are 36% more 5 to 9-year-olds than 0 to 4-year-olds. So something is happening when people's children hit age 5. What's happening is something that economists refer to as voting with your feet. Okay? What does that mean? Well, politicians draw a line on the ground called a school boundary, and then people choose their schools by choosing which side of the line to live on, and that's called voting with your feet. That has some really important effects beyond education. One thing, we refer to this as spatial sorting. So what happens is on one side of the line, you'll get better schools than on the other side of the line. This is a natural phenomenon that happens everywhere in the world, okay, not just in the U.S. In addition to schools being better on one side than the other, on the side that have the better schools, income levels are higher and property values are higher. Okay? Now, back in the 1960s, the Supreme Court said that the poll tax was illegal. You couldn't charge people to vote. But you still have to be able to afford to vote with your feet. And if you can't afford to vote with your feet, you get stuck on the side of the line with everybody else who can't vote. So who ends up getting the worst schools? Well, poor people get the worst schools. But this next part is really, really important. It's not just poor people. It's anybody who lives around poor people. So when a family that cares about education has a child that's approaching 5 years old, if they care about their child's education, they literally have to leave the poor behind. This has enormous negative consequences for the poor. The first is they become economically segregated. You've got a rich part of town and you've got a poor part of town. It also creates a problem, which we refer to as a spatial mismatch. Poor people want jobs, but the jobs aren't being created in the part of town where everybody's poor. They're being created in the part of town where middle class and wealthy people live. So the fact that people are caught on the side of the line with the bad schools doesn't just leave them bad schools. It leaves their parents jobless. Right. This ends up reducing social mobility, the ability to get into the middle class. A lot of people in poor areas don't even know anybody in the middle class. Okay. That ends up creating greater economic inequality over time. Now, the problem's actually worse because of a relatively recent innovation, which is the automobile. People don't vote with their feet, they vote with their cars, which means they can vote over much longer distances than you might have imagined they could have only a few generations ago. In my department, there are people, I'm down at NC State University, there are people who have their children in Chapel Hill's schools. They drive across probably 8, 10 high school boundaries in order to come to work at NC State because they perceive that Chapel Hill has better schools, and that's what they want. University professors are very snobbish about education. Probably put too much emphasis on it. Now, I don't want to pick on Kansas City, okay? That flight out, I call that the family flight rate, but Kansas City is not the worst city in the country. It's not even the worst in Missouri. Okay? This problem occurs in every city of any size in the United States. Some people who don't live in Atlanta are surprised when they see Atlanta there, right? Minus 15, like Kansas City. Right? But if Atlanta's viewed as a successful city. It had the Olympics there, it's up and coming. But if you look at what's really going on in Atlanta, this is a map that shows the population changes in Atlanta between the last two censuses. The area in brown lost population. Right? The area in purple around it, the suburbs, gained a lot of population. And there's a lot of gain in the suburbs and a lot of gain in traffic there in Atlanta. That little black dot that you see there, right? That's where the Atlanta Braves baseball stadium is. A lot of people are surprised to know that there are fewer people living in the city of Atlanta today than lived there in 1966 when the Atlanta Braves moved to Atlanta. Now, if you want to go see the Braves play in Atlanta, you got to go soon, because in 2017 they say they're moving to the suburbs because that's where their fans are. When an area loses the middle class, it eventually begins to lose the businesses that depend upon the middle class. So there are hundreds of people that work on game day in and around the Braves Stadium. But in 2017, those people, many of them, are going to be spatially mismatched from their jobs. Their jobs are leaving town. Now, let's look here a little closer to home for a moment. These two images, on the right, Durham, on the left, Orange County, they actually abut one another. There's not a big space in between them. The dark red areas, that family flight rate is worse than minus 20%. In the dark green area over here in the Chapel Hill School District, it's more than plus 33%. Okay? You can see something magical is happening right at the line. The whole of Durham, minus 17% for the whole county. Whole of the Chapel Hill School District, plus 21%. Okay? Now, we all know Durham schools aren't very good. But this is not just about bad schools. There are places that ostensibly have pretty good schools, but you're going to see something very similar taking place. That's Wake County. Okay? Wake County, in these dark red areas, more than minus 20, in particular southeast Raleigh and Garner. Okay? Around the periphery, you see people moving when they have children age 5. There's a statistical measure to measure the deviation between census tracts in the county. The U.S. Census Bureau classifies Durham and Orange County as one one metropolitan area. Okay? And Wake is a separate one. The difference between the areas people are moving to and moving out of for Wake County is greater than Chapel Hill and Durham combined. Now, that's not because Wake has unusually bad schools. Certainly for North Carolina, it's got pretty good schools. Apparently what's going on is, the problem is, people in Wake County care a lot about education. Okay? And so they're willing to move to get to the place where they get the best options. But that has a terrible effect on the people who get stuck and left behind. Here's the thing. Now we're going to switch to my research. It doesn't have to be this way. There are places where people don't have to be bound in by the lines that are drawn on the ground. So let's take the first example, Vermont. Vermont has something called a tuitioning system. It's been in place since the 1800s. There are 200 school districts in Vermont. 93 of them don't have a public school. They still got a school board, oddly enough, right? But no public school. What do you do when you have an area with no public school? Well, what happens is the school board raises school taxes, but then they pay tuition for children in that township to go to whatever other public school they want to outside the township, or to independent schools, private schools. Okay? Whether it's inside the state or outside the state. Okay, there are children going to school in New Hampshire. Interestingly enough, along that top border, you see a couple of those green areas. There are children going to school in Canada, paid for by Vermont taxpayers. That's ignoring a big line, the national boundary. Okay? So we were interested in what's the economic impact of this. Let's start by taking a look at what this might mean at the district level, the Winhall School District. Back in 1998, Winhall had a very poorly performing school. It was down, a little small township, down to 36 students, K through 8. Right? And they were spending 180% of the state average. People were unhappy. They were unhappy with their school. And they did something really remarkable. They took the public school and gave it to a new independent school that agreed to take every child in the district. You didn't have to go, but if you wanted to go to that new independent school, you could. So what happened? In 2015, now they're not underperforming. They're above the state average in reading, writing, and arithmetic. They've grown to 80 students, and they're only spending 82% of the state average. Moreover, that family flight rate plus 14%, people are moving in when their kids get to be 5 years old. They're coming to the township. We were interested in looking at, well, what happens to property values in these areas? So I'm going to give you an example here. We've got, in this green area, we've got a good school in Township A, one that's not quite as good in Township B, and in Township C, there is no public school. It's a tuitioning town. Right? We looked at this across the whole state, about 3,000 home sale transactions, to try to figure out, well, what's the value of being able to choose your own school? And the comparison I'm going to show you, there's a lot more here, but I'm not going to show you a big table, just the difference between Home C and Home B's value, on average across the state, is about $24,000. A home where you could choose your own school was worth $24,000 more than a home in a district where there was a better school within 20 miles. Now, that's published in the Journal of Housing Research. Now, in Sharon there's actually a private school. Actually, they don't call it a private school, an independent school. And if you talk to people in Sharon, they say, well, we don't like private schools. Well, what about Sharon? Yeah, that's our public school, right? Because anybody can go to it. So Sharon Academy, right? You might look at that and say, well, you know, they've got a private school there. The education's just better in these places. So you might think that because if we look at the students who attend Sharon Academy that are on this tuitioning system, there are 50 students from the township of Sharon, but from 7 other, they're called sending towns, other districts with tuitioning, there are children coming from these other districts to Sharon Academy. So it would look like, yeah, they've got a really good private school there. That's why property values would be higher. But it's more complex than that. Because if you look at the students who actually live in Sharon, there are 102 of them, only 50 of them go to the private school that's right there in their town. 52 of them go to places that are farther away. And the ones that leave, more than half of them go to public schools, to 4 different public schools. Okay? We teach MBA students options have value. Even options you don't expect to exercise have value. They can only choose one school at a time, but the fact that there are a lot of options they can choose from means that value is there even if they don't pick that other school. It appears that it's the choices that add value, not the quality per se. Now this is actually, there's an example here elsewhere in the Edgewood School District. A philanthropist in 1998 set aside $50 million to create a tuitioning district in Edgewood, which is in San Antonio. For 10 years, they allowed students to get a voucher to do tuitioning. In the first 3 years that this tuitioning was in effect, so this was privately funded, home values in Edgewood went up 12.7% more than in other districts that didn't have that, other similar districts that didn't have tuition. At the end of 10 years, when the vouchers ended, they came back down again. Now, there aren't very many tuitioning type districts in the U.S. Okay, there are more abroad, but I don't have time to talk about that. That's its own 20-minute talk. Okay. But there are a lot of schools that ignore the lines, in particular charter schools and private schools. We have a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to study one of these, the Orange County School of the Arts. It was started by the guy in the center there. His name is Ralph Opasek. I went to high school with Ralph, graduated with him. Okay. Ralph was passionate about the arts. And in 1984, he got a job at Los Alamitos High School as the choir director. There were 30 kids in the choir. Within 3 years, there were 350. He was really good at what he did. He was beloved, and he used that to springboard start the Orange County School of the Arts in Los Alamitos. And it was successful, and it grew. And they needed to find more space. And at that point, the city council said, actually, we're not sure we want you to grow. Okay? In fact, we're not sure we want you here at all. So you're bringing in people from across the lines. And this was a school district with plus 24, so they were pretty happy with the way things were, the family flight rate plus 24. And so the Orange County School of the Arts was going to be shut down. But there was a mayor in Santa Ana, California, Miguel Polito, who was watching what was going on here. He contacts Ralph, and he says, Ralph, they say they don't want you because you're bringing in traffic. We wish we had traffic here. Okay? You can roll a bowling ball down Main Street, and the buildings on both sides of the street are empty. And if you're willing to come here, okay, we will help to get you into some space. So the Orange County School of the Arts moved to Santa Ana, California, right, which has the worst family flight rate in all of Orange County. Right? 90% minority, mostly Hispanic. They moved into that building right there. Right? It was an old bank building. Turned out to be really fortunate because as they expanded, there was a lot of other empty real estate around them, and they were able to expand into those other buildings. Okay? Almost 2,000 students there now. This mayor was really visionary. He brought in 2 other charter schools. Okay? Today, there are 3,500 children going to school within 2 blocks of Main Street right there, plus hundreds of teachers and staff that have come to these businesses that have been stood up right there on Main Street. Now, I'm a finance and real estate professor. What actually was of interest to me is that empty block right there. And the reason that's interesting is because a developer acquired that property, has all the entitlements to build that, which would be the tallest building in all of Orange County. You can see the school, right, this church right here in the front, that is now Symphony Hall. It used to be a church that wasn't being used. They're in 3 bank buildings. They have 3 vaults. Teacher workrooms are in vaults up and down Main Street. The mayor said, I talked to the mayor, he said, one of the things that was really surprising is the crime rate dropped. It's down like 80%. He said, it's really, really striking. Now, it turns out there's been research done on this. Down in Charlotte, North Carolina, okay, when the Supreme Court ruled you couldn't use race for assignments, Charlotte was concerned that their schools would resegregate. And so they allowed students who were going to, and for the most part, to poor, high minority schools to apply to go to the other school, and to another school. But not everybody could go. They didn't have enough spots. So what they ended up doing was they had a lottery. Some people won the lottery, some didn't. A Harvard professor tracked the crime rates of the kids that applied. The school choice winners committed fewer crimes, and the effects were concentrated. They spent fewer days in jail for the next 7 years. The effects were concentrated among minority males who committed half as much crime if they got what they asked for, got into the school they asked for. Right? With that in mind, you might be less surprised to know that Santa Ana, California, 90% minority, was rated by Forbes magazine a year ago as the 4th safest city in the country. Right? I'd like to bring that to Durham. Right? This was based upon the research for the National Endowment for the Arts. It's based upon a study that we did on the first Luddy School, right? Franklin Academy. And at Franklin Academy, we looked at how families moved after they got their kids into school. And the school's location is that black dot at the center. All those other dots were families that got in and then later moved. What you see is that school is enormously attractive. And back to where they started and where they ended up. Right? The attraction level of that school is greater than any study has ever found a workplace to be. People care more about their kids' commute than their own. Right? The changing commutes probably saved about 1 million miles of commuting over the time they were in the school. Right? If you want to bring families that care about education to an area, you got to use the right bait. I think you're looking at it. You're probably sitting in it. Right. This is another charter school in a blighted area. Neighborhood popped up around it. I'm going to show you this last one down in Panama City. Developers are figuring this out. There's an airport down in Panama City. They built a new one farther out. The city wanted to redevelop this. The developer said, the schools aren't very good. We've got to do something about that. They took the terminal building there and converted it to a charter school. And in Florida, if a developer builds a charter school, they can reserve half the seats for students in the development. There are now 300 students, K through 3, attending that school. There's nothing else on that property yet but that school. There are 300 students attending K through 3, 1,000 people on the waiting list. If you buy in the neighborhood, you jump the queue. They're going to make a fortune. So, what's needed here? Well, we'll call them Community Protection Revitalization Scholarships, CPR scholarships. This is what's needed for Southeast, for Durham. In these areas, probably the equivalent of what we're calling ESAs now, areas where there's concentrated poverty and where people are moving out when their children get to be school age. In those areas, every child that's there should get tuitioning. You give it to the poor for social justice reasons. But you also give it to the middle class who aren't there now, but you want them to come. And you give it to the middle class because the poor need the middle class to be willing to live near them. Because they bring the jobs and the economic vitality that changes all those other problems. There's a long laundry list of good things that would happen from this. And because I'm getting the cut here, I'm going to jump through them. All right? So let me just summarize very quickly. And I'm going to use one current event piece. Assign schools. You draw that line on the ground, you assign people to schools, then people vote with their feet. That leads to economic segregation and concentrated poverty. Now, recent current event. Last week, Housing and Urban Development announced a final rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing. And the goal in that was to move subsidized housing into areas, quote, rich with opportunity. What this means on the ground here is to move poor people in Durham and Southeast Raleigh into public housing in Chapel Hill and Cary and North Raleigh and Wake Forest. Now that's going to be controversial, okay? Well, it's going to be controversial. But what HUD is attempting to do, okay, is they're interested in dealing with this problem of concentrated poverty. They say that's a real issue, and it is a big issue, concentrated poverty. Right? But what they're targeting here is the symptom. Right? They're trying to treat the symptom, right? And when they treat the symptom, without treating the root cause, it's just going to keep coming back. What they need to be targeting is the root cause. You give people choices so that they can vote in place. They don't have to vote with their feet and leave. Give them choices so they can vote in place, and that problem disappears. And once that problem disappears, the other problems will begin to fade away.